And with that, it is my honor to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Andrew Shakman, CEO of Leanpath and a longtime member of ReFed's Advisory Council. Please welcome Andrew to the stage.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it. Well, after this amazing conference, I hope that you are all feeling armed and ready to drive change. And hopefully not just any change, but impactful change, big change, fast change, right? We heard the theme that Dana introduced on the first day. Absolutely critical that we push. Now, as skilled change makers, I think it behooves us, before we go out to make this change, to take a minute to think a little bit about the obstacles that we might encounter going forward. And so I'm going to spend just a few minutes here as we wrap up reflecting on a few of the things that I've learned, and particularly one obstacle that I've seen in my now 18 years working on food waste prevention. It's hard to believe it's been 18 years. So food waste, I think we would all agree, is a compelling issue. It is the very definition of a nexus topic, and I think by any measure, food waste should be a no-brainer. Unfortunately, the scale of our movement today does not yet match the scale of the problem. And that's not, of course, for lack of effort or lack of progress, and I think this conference is a testament to the tremendous collective accomplishment that's happening. I mean, coming out of this, I am energized. I hope all of you are. There is so much going on that's absolutely wonderful. But I've also observed, and I've talked to many of people in the room who have felt the same way, that this work is still difficult. And in fact, arguably, it's too difficult given the magnitude of the problem that we're working on. And so that's caused me to reflect on one really central question. What stands in the way of our movement accelerating more quickly to a larger scale? What stands in the way? And as I have reflected on that, I've realized that there is one common dynamic which I have seen actually the whole time I've been working on food waste. I've seen it in kitchens in food service. I've seen it in corporations. I've seen it generally outside food service and other parts of the food business. And I see it today. And it affects both change makers as well as operators, people who are generating waste in the course of their work. And that theme is that people tend to bring limiting beliefs to their work on food waste unconsciously. We overemphasize the near-term operational risks that we have to manage, and we underemphasize the external long-term risks that our organizations face. And by that I mean climate change and food insecurity, and the associated elements around biodiversity loss, of course, soil health, nutrition, etc. As a result of this, we lower our expectations because of those limiting beliefs with what we think we can get done. And in some ways, we almost accept that food waste is part of the problem. So again, people overemphasize the near term, underemphasize the long term, establish some limiting beliefs that constrain our action, reduce our ambitions. We end up managing in many ways to the wrong risks, and we end up setting smaller and slower bets than we could. So I went to my first food service kitchen in 2004, and it was a totally alien experience for me. I was coming from marketing work, selling consumer packaged goods, so food on the internet. And in fact, to this day, I think I am still probably, through my work at Leanpath, atoning for the fact that I sold Captain Crunch to children on the internet. And I got their parents to buy it for them. I engineered that. And even worse, I sold instant coffee, not just to children, but to anyone. And so lessons were learned from this experience. But one of the first things I realized was I needed to go into kitchens and I needed to understand what was happening. And so I managed to get a general manager at a convention center to let me show up and talk to them about food waste. And so I arrived, and the general manager, with whom I was supposed to meet, quickly whisked me down the hall and into the office of the chef and said, "Hey, this guy's here to talk to you about your food waste." Had not given this guy a heads up. The manager who welcomed me and had really no interest in meeting with me. The chef, you can imagine, was gleeful by this introduction, right? I mean, definitely an icy kind of experience, but he was game to give me a tour. So I went on the tour. And we walked around, and I looked in the bins, and I saw a lot of food waste. I saw edible food, I saw trimmings, and the talk track, though, as we went through this, was what a great operation it was and how they had very little waste. And so at the end, he turns to me and he says, so as you can see, we don't have a food waste problem here. And he was, at that point, very happy to send me on my way. I was confused. Like, how could I reconcile what I was seeing in these bins with what he was saying? And so I said, I need to dig into this. And so I spent the better part of a year on the road almost every week in kitchens. And I was learning and training at the same time on food service technology or food waste prevention technology. And it was an amazing learning experience. And I found myself not long after that experience at the convention center at a kitchen in a hospital in the Northeast. And I went to the most exciting place in a kitchen, which is the pot wash area. Now, if you're in the food waste business, guys, I have to tell you, this is the most exciting part of a kitchen because it's where the crimes happen. It's where the stuff goes into the garbage. It's where we can learn a lot. So I show up in there, and there's a pot washer who works in this room. And he looks at me, and I would say the expression on his face looked a lot like that chef at the convention center when I walked in. He was seemingly not very happy to see me. No, okay, he says, what do you need? I said, I'm here to talk to you about food waste and help out. And he looks at me for a long pause, and he says, it's about time. He goes on to tell me about the tremendous amount of food waste that he himself puts down the garbage disposer every day. And he talks about how he volunteers at his church on many of his days off, and how he thinks about what he could do with that food to make a difference for people in his community. Okay, I'm like, this is good. The frontline team understands this problem. Of course, my uplift lasted about one day. I went right down the street to a related hospital where I was going to do training, and I showed up bright and early at the general manager's office where the door was locked. And I sat in a very uncomfortable chair for a very long time, waiting for this person to show up. Now, mind you, I'd flown across the country to do this training. Eventually, this woman shows up, and she, of course, had forgotten there was any training going on food waste at all, and was not happy that she was going to have to spend any time thinking about food waste. And so I found myself in this situation wondering, like, how is it that the pot washer understands a problem that at that time the managers and the chef didn't? It's an interesting question. And so as I thought about it, I realized it really comes down to what risks you think you need to manage. And the pot washer saw the importance of the big risk, which was feeding people. And so I was wondering, what is it that the managers and the chefs are managing to? What is the risk that they are thinking about? What's causing them to manage and approach food waste in a different way? So of course, I watched and I asked, and I started to talk to chefs about why they made so much. Here's what they told me. They said, we can't afford to run out, so we make more food than we need. We can't afford to have someone come through our buffet where the first customer sees something great and the last customer doesn't. So we have to make sure we have the same experience for the first and last customer, and we justify having all the food out on the buffet at the end. We have to merchandise in a bountiful and beautiful way, lest someone thinks that this food is not, attractive. They think it's picked over and sparse. So we have to have a ton of food. It has to be big. Okay? So then we started talking about food safety. And they said, look, we know we throw away food that's perfectly good all the time. But we have policies that we have to follow that are really black and white, and this is what we need to do. And if we don't know, well, we just practice, we err to the side of throwing it out. If in doubt, throw it out. Okay. So I'm putting this together, and I'm realizing this food waste problem, this is not accidental. This isn't careless. This, folks, is a business strategy. People are managing and mitigating other short-term operational risks in their facilities by using food waste. It's perceived as a low-cost way of solving a problem. And clearly it's not low cost, but that's how it was being approached. And so, I started to think, does this really need to be this way? And of course, in my travels, I've learned it absolutely doesn't need to be that way. This is a this is a belief system that is a constrained belief. We don't have to be solving our problems with food waste. And so when you work back from the point of view that we should be intolerant of food waste and simply not allow it to be the answer to other problems, suddenly things snap into place. And when you talk to the chefs at that point, you say, gosh, couldn't you shift at the end of a buffet period to cook to order so you don't have a big pan of eggs out there that are just getting old? Might your customers not be excited to have you cook those scrambled eggs fresh rather than having the eggs that were 2 hours old served to them? Could we not have a win-win here where we actually serve better food and waste less food? Could we not do that? And of course the answer is yes, we can. And so the takeaway from all of this for me was there were a ton of limiting beliefs in these kitchens by which people were believing that they had to waste food, that it was necessary to solve other operational risks, and they were not thinking about the big picture, which the pot washer saw, which was people who didn't have food to eat while food was going down the drain, and the incongruity of that reality. So that's an example from food service. But this is not unique to food service. This is applicable in any part of the food system that is touching food. We have operational exigencies and things that we have to manage that are in our hands, and we have limiting beliefs. And we simply have to go after these limiting beliefs, and we have to insert that intolerance of food waste and say, how are we going to not accept that that is an answer that is okay? Now, it's one thing to do this in one kitchen or a couple of kitchens, but we need to do this everywhere. And we need to do this not just in food service, we need to do it in food retail and food distribution and food manufacturing and in agriculture. We need to find literally millions of points of change. And the way we're going to get there, as we heard yesterday from Chef Andrew Zimmern, was you need the big companies to be involved. The largest players have to be part of systemic change. We simply can't change this entire system without having those folks engaged in this process. And I know that many of them are in this room, and I empathize. I know that there are complex balancing acts inside big companies, just like there are in kitchens. And I know that there are short-term operational risks that we have to manage that lead to limiting beliefs as well when we make business decisions. And so what does that look like? Well, one that I see is related to innovation. When we start something new, and it's the tension between certainty and scale. The belief that we must be certain before we scale. So I'll be the first to admit that many innovations don't work and that you've got to test them and you've got to make sure that things do work before you go crazy. But the real question comes down to what is the burden of proof that's appropriate? Because what I see is that left to our own instincts, we will set a burden of proof that's way up here. It's near like no daylight. There is absolutely nothing that could go wrong, and we also add on top of that, we need full buy-in. Like that's required. So we test and test and test and test and test. And if you look at change efforts, one of the best ways to kill a change effort is to set an unattainable criteria for success, okay? And that happens. And we see this happen over and over. And so we've got to really reflect on what are our belief systems around certainty, and just how much proof do we need before we know something's good and we should do more of it. And I saw this play out at Sodexo a number of years ago, and their CEO, former CEO, Denny Machuel, noted that they were doing a ton of pilots around food waste prevention. And at some point his quote was, "We have more pilots than Air France." French company, more pilots than Air France. And he made a leadership decision to say that's enough, let's go big. And that led to some really great things. So I think it's critical not just that we consider the burden of proof, but that we bring these questions to our senior leaders. Because at the end of the day, the biggest risk decisions have to go to the top of our organizations, and they need to be engaged in this process. And so we've got to think really carefully about how much proof is enough. Another limiting belief that I see has to do with the scoreboard that we use for success in any innovation project around food waste. So how often do we talk about the triple bottom line? Quite often. It's a regular talking point. But how often do we actually underwrite our projects to triple bottom line criteria? What I see is that we typically come in and underwrite to a financial business case, whatever that innovation effort is, and then we say, and plus there's a bonus of environmental and social benefits. So I would say let's stop that. Like, We need to challenge that limiting belief. We do not have to make a case with two hands tied behind our back. We need to make a full-throated case about the full triple bottom line benefits of the work on food waste. And let me suggest to you, let's start on the environmental front by connecting this to carbon very clearly. And we've heard that throughout this conference about the importance of connecting food waste and making that crosswalk vivid. I think that the work that Vera is doing is terrific in building standards to be able to tell that story between addressing food waste and how it directly translates quantitatively, numerically into carbon impact. We need to do this. Our movement will only be stronger when we get good at this. It's still ambiguous, it's still hard, but it's absolutely worth doing, and we can't have the limiting belief that it's not possible, and we can't have the limiting belief that it's not necessary. The other KPI, I think, is on the social front. We do need KPIs on what are we doing with excess edible food? Do we have recovery objectives? Are we stating them clearly? And are we actually designing, when we repeatedly produce excess food, ways to not do that? All of these things were things we can do better, but our job is to represent maximally the change that we are making, not minimally. A third tension that I see has to do with a topic that has been discussed a bit here, which is transparency. There is often a limiting belief, and I know many here are pretty pro-transparency, which is great, but I think broadly in our industry, there is often a worry that if we're transparent about the food waste initiatives we're pursuing and our food waste data, that we will in some way be shamed in the public sphere, that we will provide critical, adverse insight to competitors. Maybe the thing not spoken is we will reduce our accountability, our wiggle room, or increase our accountability and reduce our wiggle room, so that we'll actually have put stuff out there where people can pin us down. So those thoughts are limiting beliefs. The reality is that we have a lot more to lose by not being transparent, by being seen to be silent on this critical issue, by not being public about what we're trying to do and bringing a cadre of innovators to the table to help us do it, by being seen as insincere by our own employees when we're perceived to be addressing wiggle room. And perhaps the biggest reason is if we're not talking about what we're doing, we're missing the opportunity to set new social norms. We have to build norms that change. And that's a contribution that we each make. Yes, in our own initiatives, but then how we talk about them builds the context for all of this important work that we're doing. So from a transparency point of view, let's focus on what it can do for us, not what it can do to hurt us. Now, I've talked today about limiting beliefs, and I've talked about them in kitchens, and I've talked about them in corporations. But clearly, we have them everywhere, whether it's academics or it's NGOs or it's governments, investors, dare I say, food waste solutions innovators. Even we have limiting beliefs, right? And so we've got to be curious about those. If you're an investor, think about it. What is your limiting belief about what is an entrepreneur? Who that person is, what that person looks like, how big a fancy story they tell, how big a lie do they have to tell about how big their thing is going to be tomorrow, or how real are they about doing the work? These are interesting questions. By the way, I don't think the lies are actually true. Things will be big, but there's a dynamic where people sort of have to tell a story. As investors, let's think about how we can make those conversations productive. As NGOs, I sometimes see a limiting belief about the ability to be in close proximity to for-profit business. How can we be seen endorsing or collaborating with for-profit business? And I would say that's a limiting belief. The job of all of us in this ecosystem, governments, NGOs, people who create context, is to uplift that innovation ecosystem. It's absolutely essential. So we've got to be curious about these things. So in closing, I'd like to ask you guys to imagine a world where we're consistently paying attention to these limiting beliefs. Because the reality is that the risks we're facing are not associated with projects that we launch that don't work out, that fail, ideas that don't end up taking hold. The risk that we are facing that really, really matters is that we don't address climate change, and we don't address food insecurity, and we don't address the host of nexus issues around food waste. That is the real risk. And you guys in this room and on the virtual conference, and the people that you know, and the people that we're going to recruit into this, we are the change makers, right? So we are the people who have to have high expectations. Because if we don't have them, we're not going to move practice. So we need transformational leadership, and we need that from this group. So I would say to you in your own initiatives, and when you engage with others who are working on their initiatives, let's practice a chapter out of improv theater, which is yes and. When you hear about a project, yes and. How can it be bigger? Yes and. How can it be faster? Yes and. How can it be more impactful? And so as you go home and you sit in your airplane seat today or in a car or a train or wherever you're going, maybe you're walking, you're biking, you're being very responsible, take a minute and just think to yourself, do I have any limiting beliefs? Is there any way where I'm not expecting enough of the change that I can make on food waste? And so let's go big, let's go fast, let's go all in, let's go 100%, and let's know and be confident that we are absolutely involved in a critical transformation. So I'm looking forward to next year and seeing all that's been accomplished. Thank you.